All right, let's go. Number 10. Operation Northwoods. In 1962, the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the United States military submitted a classified document to the Secretary of Defense. The document proposed staging terrorist attacks on American soil and blaming Cuba to justify a full military invasion. Plans included bombing American cities, sinking boats carrying Cuban refugees, and shooting down a civilian aircraft over international waters. Every member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff reviewed and signed the proposal. The President rejected it and dismissed the general responsible. The document remained classified for 35 years. When it was finally released in 1997 through the work of the Assassination Records Review Board, a body created not to investigate terrorism plots but to examine the Kennedy assassination files, it surfaced as a footnote in an archive declassification process that nobody was specifically looking for. A researcher found it, not an investigation, an accident of bureaucratic proximity. The proposal runs to 15 pages. It is not vague. It names specific methods, specific locations, specific cover stories. It describes how the attacks would be designed to produce maximum civilian casualties while maintaining plausible deniability. It outlines a media strategy for directing public outrage toward Cuba before any investigation could begin. But here is where the document stops being a historical curiosity and becomes something that cannot be filed away comfortably. Operation Northwoods was not proposed by rogue actors operating outside the system. It was produced by the highest uniformed military authority in the United States, reviewed through official channels, formatted on official letterhead, and signed by every man authorized to sign it. The system worked exactly as it was designed to work. The document traveled up the correct chain of command and received the correct approvals at every level until it reached the one person who said no. One person. When the files were released, no congressional hearing was called, no official statement was issued, no one who had signed the document was alive to face questions, and no institution that had produced it offered an explanation. The government that had classified the document for 35 years simply stopped classifying it, and the silence that followed was indistinguishable from the silence that had come before. Number 9. Project MKUltra. In 1953, the Central Intelligence Agency launched a covert research program aimed at developing techniques for controlling human behavior through chemical, biological, and psychological means. The program was called MKUltra. It ran for 20 years, involved at least 150 research projects, and was conducted across more than 80 institutions in the United States and Canada, including universities, hospitals, prisons, and military installations. The subjects were not always aware they were subjects. Patients in psychiatric hospitals received LSD doses without consent or notification. Prison inmates were administered experimental drugs under the cover of medical treatment. Mental health patients were subjected to weeks of electroconvulsive therapy, induced sleep and sensory deprivation in combination with drug administration, in procedures designed to erase existing behavioral patterns and replace them with new ones. A CIA officer named Frank Olson died after being dosed with LSD without his knowledge. The official determination was suicide. His family spent decades disputing that conclusion, and a 1994 exhumation found physical evidence on Olson's skull consistent with a blow to the head before the fall. The program was not discovered, it was nearly destroyed. In 1973, CIA Director Hizzer Helms ordered the destruction of all MKUltra files. The order was carried out. What survived was an estimated 10 boxes of financial accounting of a program that ran for 20 years across 150 sub-projects. They were not the program.
They were the receipts. Everything that documented what had actually been done to how many people across how many institutions over 2 decades was deliberately incinerated by the director of the agency that had ordered it. The Senate heard testimony about a program whose records no longer existed, conducted by an institution that was simultaneously investigating itself, about experiments performed on people who, in many cases, had never been told they were part of an experiment, and in some cases, never learned it for the rest of their lives. The apologies came later. The full accounting never did.
Number 8. Operation Gladio. At the end of the Second World War, NATO and the intelligence services of several Western European governments established a network of secret paramilitary units across the European continent. The units were called stay-behind networks. Their official purpose was to operate as resistance forces in the event of a Soviet invasion, to remain hidden inside occupied territory, conduct sabotage, and support Allied forces from behind enemy lines. The Soviet invasion never came. What came instead across Italy, Belgium, Germany, France, Greece, Turkey, and at least 8 other countries were decades of bombings, assassinations, and political violence that investigators now believe were in some cases carried out by the stay-behind networks themselves against their own civilian populations. In Italy, the operation was called Gladio. Parliamentary investigations beginning in 1990 found links to Gladio operatives and some of the most violent episodes of what Italians call the Years of Lead, a period of domestic terrorism from the late 1960s through the 1980s that killed hundreds of civilians. The strategy had a name. It was called the strategy of tension. The documented theory, recovered from Gladio-linked sources and confirmed by Italian parliamentary testimony, held that bombing civilian targets and blaming leftist groups would keep Western European populations frightened, politically conservative, and supportive of strong government, terror as electoral policy, violence as a mechanism for managing democratic outcomes. But here is what makes Gladio different from a conspiracy theory. In 1990, Italian Prime Minister Giulio Andreotti confirmed the existence of Gladio in a statement to the Italian Parliament. He did not deny it. He confirmed it, provided partial documentation, and stated that similar networks had existed across NATO member states. The European Parliament passed a resolution the same year condemning the networks and demanding a full investigation. Several member state governments acknowledged their own networks existed. The investigations that followed were conducted by the governments of countries that had run the networks, using evidence held by the intelligence services that had managed them, and the conclusions varied significantly by country. No individual was ever convicted specifically for Gladio-linked violence in any NATO member state. The networks existed, the violence occurred, the documentation connects them. The accountability does not follow.
Number 7. COINTELPRO. Between 1956 and 1971, the Federal Bureau of Investigation ran a classified domestic intelligence program called COINTELPRO, an acronym for Counterintelligence Program. Its stated purpose was to identify and neutralize domestic organizations the FBI considered threats to national security. Its actual operations included forged letters designed to provoke violence between rival organizations, anonymous letters sent to the spouses of activists containing fabricated evidence of infidelity, letters sent to employers identifying employees as communists or subversives, and a documented campaign against Martin Luther King Jr. that included an anonymous letter encouraging him to commit suicide. That letter was sent in November 1964, weeks after King received the Nobel Peace Prize. The program was not discovered through investigation. It was exposed because on the night of March 8, 1971, a group of activists broke into an FBI field office in Media, Pennsylvania, and stole every document they could carry. They mailed the documents to journalists. Several newspapers published them despite direct requests from the FBI not to do so.
the word COINTELPRO appeared in the stolen files. Until that moment, the program's existence had been unknown outside the FBI. The full scope was investigated by the Church Committee, a Senate Select Committee that conducted hearings between 1975 and 1976. The Church Committee found that between 1956 and 1971, the FBI had opened files on more than 1 million American citizens. It had conducted operations against civil rights organizations, anti-war groups, feminist organizations, and political parties. It had, in the words of the committee's final report, used clearly illegal techniques to disrupt, discredit, and destroy organizations the Bureau had unilaterally decided were dangerous. He made that statement in 1975.
Number 6. Operation Ajax. In August 1953, the elected Prime Minister of Iran was removed from power in a coup d'etat. His name was Mohammad Mossadegh. He had been democratically elected in 1951 and had subsequently moved to nationalize Iran's oil industry, which had been controlled primarily by the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, a British corporation in which the British government held majority ownership. For 40 years, the United States government officially denied any involvement in the coup. The operation was run jointly by the CIA and British intelligence under the name Operation Ajax on the American side and Operation Boot on the British side. Declassified CIA documents released in 2013, the first official acknowledgement of American involvement, confirmed that the agency planned and executed the operation in full. The documents describe the bribing of Iranian military officers, the orchestration of street violence using paid provocateurs, the coordination of pro-Shah demonstrations designed to appear as a popular uprising, and the direct management of coup timing by CIA officers operating in Tehran. The operation took 7 days. Mossadegh was arrested, tried for treason by a military tribunal, and sentenced to 3 years in prison. He spent the remainder of his life under house arrest. The Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, was reinstalled and ruled Iran for 26 years with increasing authoritarianism. The secret police force he expanded during those years, known as SAVAK, became one of the most feared domestic intelligence organizations in the world, documented by human rights organizations for systematic torture and the disappearance of political opponents. But here is where the 40 years of denial carry a weight that the eventual admission does not dissolve. During those 40 years, American officials publicly praised Iranian democracy while privately knowing it had been dismantled by American hands. American presidents met with the Shah and endorsed his government, while the classified files describing how that government came to exist sat in vaults in Langley. When the Iranian Revolution of 1979 brought a government to power that viewed the United States as an enemy, American commentators expressed confusion at the depth of Iranian anger. The classified files that would have explained that anger completely were not released for another 34 years. Number 5. The Gulf of Tonkin. On August 4, 1964, President Lyndon Johnson addressed the American nation and announced that North Vietnamese torpedo boats had attacked United States Navy destroyers in the Gulf of Tonkin in an unprovoked act of aggression. Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin resolution within 3 days. It authorized the president to use military force in Southeast Asia without a formal declaration of war. It was the legal foundation for the full escalation of American involvement in Vietnam. The August 4 attack did not happen. The first incident, on August 2, involved a genuine exchange of fire between North Vietnamese patrol boats and the USS Maddox. The second incident, reported 2 nights later, was based on radar returns and sonar readings interpreted under poor weather conditions by crews that had been under fire 48 hours earlier.
The commander of the task force cabled Washington within hours of his initial report to say he was uncertain the attack had occurred and recommended waiting for daylight assessment before taking action. That cable did not change the response. The National Security Agency's own classified history of the Gulf of Tonkin incidents, written internally and not released until 2005 through a Freedom of Information Act request by the National Security Archive, concluded that the signals intelligence available at the time did not support the conclusion that a second attack had occurred. The study had been completed in 2001, but was not declassified for 4 more years. But here is the dimension of the Gulf of Tonkin that the word mistake does not adequately address. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara acknowledged in his 1995 memoir, and again in the 2003 documentary The Fog of War, that serious doubts about the second attack existed at the highest levels of the administration on the night the decision was made to retaliate. The question of whether an attack occurred and what to do in response were, by his own account, processed simultaneously rather than sequentially. The legal authorization for a war that would last 11 years and kill more than 58,000 American soldiers was passed by Congress in 72 hours on the basis of an incident whose existence was doubted by the people reporting it while they were reporting it. The resolution was not repealed until 1971.
Number 4. Operation Paperclip. At the end of the Second World War, American military and intelligence personnel entered Germany ahead of Soviet forces with a specific mission that had nothing to do with combat. They were looking for scientists. Specifically, they were looking for the engineers and researchers who had built the Nazi war machine: rocket scientists, aeronautical engineers, chemical weapons developers, medical researchers, and they were under orders to bring them to the United States before the Soviets could recruit them. The program was called Operation Paperclip. It brought more than 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians to the United States between 1945 and 1959. The Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, which ran the program, had a specific problem. Many of the scientists it wanted to recruit had records that disqualified them from entry to the United States under existing immigration law. The disqualifying factors included membership in the Nazi Party, SS membership, and, in several cases, direct involvement in war crimes. The solution the JIOA adopted was to alter or expunge the scientists' records before submitting them for immigration review. A 1947 State Department review found that the JIOA was systematically falsifying security dossiers. The review was classified. Wernher von Braun, who became the central figure in the American space program and received the National Medal of Science in 1975, was an SS officer and a member of the Nazi Party. The V-2 rockets he designed for the German military were built using concentration camp labor. Thousands of those laborers died in the production facilities. This information was in the original dossiers that were reviewed and modified before von Braun was cleared for entry. But here is what Operation Paperclip demonstrates that extends beyond the individual cases. The program required the active falsification of government records by a government agency, approved at levels senior enough to override State Department objections, sustained across more than a decade, and kept from public knowledge for 30 years. It was not a decision made in the chaos of war's final days. It was a sustained institutional choice, maintained and defended long after the immediate pressures that might have excused it had passed. The scientists it imported contributed genuinely to American scientific achievement. That contribution and the methods used to obtain it occupied the same history simultaneously, and for 3 decades, only one of them was publicly acknowledged.
Number 3. Operation Mockingbird. Beginning in the late 1940s and continuing through at least the 1970s, the Central Intelligence Agency developed and maintained a covert program to influence domestic and foreign news coverage. The program involved recruiting journalists at major American news organizations, placing CIA officers in editorial positions at media outlets, subsidizing foreign newspapers and magazines, and in some cases, directly producing news content that was then published under the bylines of journalists who were on the agency's payroll. The program had no single name in all of its documentation. The name Operation Mockingbird, which it is most commonly known by, appears in limited CIA records. What appears more consistently across the declassified record is the operational reality, the recruitment, the placement, the payments, and the content. The Church Committee investigation in 1975 confirmed that the CIA had maintained relationships with American journalists across multiple major news organizations. CIA Director William Colby testified that the agency had worked with approximately 40 American journalists in the preceding years. Carl Bernstein, in a 1977 Rolling Stone article based on CIA documents and source interviews, reported that the actual number exceeded 400 and included journalists at some of the most prominent news outlets in the country. But here is where the confirmed facts of Operation Mockingbird produce a problem that no subsequent media transparency can fully resolve. Journalism's function as a check on government power depends on its independence from the institutions it covers. The documented fact that the CIA embedded paid assets within American newsrooms for decades does not mean that every story produced by those newsrooms during that period was compromised. It means that no one reading those stories at the time had the information necessary to evaluate whether they were. The readers of newspapers whose journalists were on the CIA payroll were not deceived by fiction. They were deceived by the removal of a context they could not know was missing. The institutional trust that makes journalism function as a democratic mechanism was being used as a delivery system for information management, and the consumers of that journalism had no way to know the channel had been modified. The practice of embedding intelligence assets in media organizations was formally prohibited by executive order until 1976. Whether the prohibition has been consistently honored is, by the nature of the programs it was designed to stop, impossible to verify from the outside.
Number 2. The Tuskegee Syphilis Study. In 1932, the United States Public Health Service began a clinical study in Macon County, Alabama. The study enrolled 399 black men who had been diagnosed with syphilis and 201 uninfected men as controls. The men were told that they were being treated for bad blood, a local term that covered a range of ailments, and were offered free medical examinations, free meals on examination days, and burial insurance in exchange for their participation. They were not being treated. They were being observed. The study was designed to document the natural progression of untreated syphilis in black men specifically. Treatment was never part of the protocol. When penicillin became the standard of care for syphilis in 1947, the men enrolled in the study were not offered it. When researchers were informed that participants were receiving treatment elsewhere, steps were taken to ensure they stopped receiving it. The study continued for 40 years. It ended in 1972 only because a public health service employee named Peter Buxton had leaked information about it to a journalist after raising concerns internally for several years and being repeatedly told the study should continue. The Associated Press published the story in July 1972. Congressional hearings followed. By the time the study ended, 28 of the original participants had died directly from syphilis, 100 had died from related complications, 40 wives had been infected, and 19 children had been born with congenital syphilis. But here is what the 40 years of the Tuskegee study produced that persists beyond the event itself. Researchers studying vaccination uptake, clinical trial participation, and preventative care engagement in Black American communities have documented a persistent and statistically significant pattern of medical institutional distrust that correlates directly with awareness of Tuskegee. The study did not simply harm the men enrolled in it. It introduced a rational basis for distrust of medical institutions into a community's collective experience, and that distrust has had measurable effects on health outcomes for decades after the study ended. The harm was not contained by the study's termination, it was transmitted forward. President Clinton issued a formal apology on behalf of the federal government in 1997. The final survivor of the original study died in 2004.
Number 1. PRISM and the Architecture of Mass Surveillance. On June 5, 2013, The Guardian published a classified court order revealing that the United States government had been collecting the telephone records of tens of millions of Americans with no individualized suspicion of any crime. The following day, The Washington Post published a separate set of documents describing a program called PRISM, through which the National Security Agency had direct access to the servers of 9 major American technology companies: Microsoft, Yahoo, Google, Facebook, Paltalk, YouTube, Skype, AOL, and Apple, and was collecting internet communications including email, video, photos, voice calls, and stored data. The source of the documents was a former NSA contractor named Edward Snowden. For years before the Snowden disclosures, senior American intelligence officials had publicly and under oath denied the existence of mass domestic surveillance programs. In March 2013, 3 months before the first publication, Director of National Intelligence James Clapper was asked directly by Senator Ron Wyden during a Senate Intelligence Committee hearing whether the NSA collected any type of data at all on millions of Americans. Clapper answered no. That answer was given under oath. After the Snowden disclosures made the answer's falsity impossible to maintain, Clapper stated that he had given the most truthful or least untruthful answer he could while protecting classified information. He was not prosecuted for perjury. The legal framework for the surveillance programs was constructed through a secret court, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, whose rulings themselves were classified. American citizens were subject to a body of law that governed the collection of their communications and that they were legally prohibited from knowing existed. The court that interpreted that law operated in secret, heard arguments from only one side, and produced legal opinions that were not subject to normal appellate review. But here is where PRISM differs from every other program on this list in one specific dimension. Every other operation documented here was historical by the time it became public. The governments that had lied had, in many cases, changed. The officials who had authorized the programs were retired or dead. The accountability that did not come had at least the quality of lateness to explain its absence. PRISM was different. The infrastructure it described was not historical. It was operational, it was current, and it was designed to be permanent. The technological capacity it revealed did not diminish when it was exposed. It continued to exist, to expand, and to be governed by the same classified legal frameworks that had allowed it to be built without public knowledge. James Clapper testified falsely to the Senate in March 2013. The surveillance programs he was asked about continued after his testimony. They continued after the Snowden disclosures. They continued after the congressional debates that followed. The Church Committee's most alarming finding, stated in 1975, was that the surveillance infrastructure it had uncovered was capable, if directed inward, of a form of control with no available means of resistance. 38 years later, the infrastructure was significantly larger, and this time it had already been directed inward. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.